Whew, that's scary. Okay. So I'm a development economist, which means that I focus on questions around poverty and inequality, primarily in low-income countries. And one of my areas of research is gender inequality. Gender inequities exist worldwide, which means that some half of the world's population is systematically lagging behind on their basic standard of life, and that society as a whole is missing out on the potential contributions that women have to offer. Now, these inequities exist in many domains, including educational access, mortality outcomes, and the type of work that women do, including how much they're compensated, access to productive inputs, and holding leadership roles. Now, the first step to reducing gender gaps is to understand what's causing them. And in exploring causes, a key question is the role of discrimination. Economists have a long history of studying discrimination. Featured here is a 1957 text of Nobel Prize winner Gary Becker's book on economics of discrimination. But it's really challenging to identify if discrimination is at play. Consider, for example, gender gaps in credit markets. Men and women often engage in very different business sectors, such as technology versus tailoring. And so it's hard to know if a banker is discriminating against women or simply just responding to legitimate business differences. And so similar to spot the differences puzzles in highlight magazines that I used to do as a child, now as a researcher, I look at two different contexts and try to hold everything identical except for gender, so that I can be confident that any outcomes I observe must have been due to gender discrimination. In addition to the existence of discrimination, I also tend to think about why discrimination might be occurring. And we have different theories as to what is behind that discrimination. So in one strand of my research, we explore the role of gender discrimination in access to credit, which is a key input in business success and an input that we know women have less access to. So with local collaborators in Ethiopia, we designed a business plan competition, which will be featured right here, where we invited businesses to apply and we recruited loan officers from various Ethiopian banks to judge those businesses. Now in Ethiopia, women are very active in the labor market and many of them have their own businesses. But the challenge in understanding whether loan officers discriminate against those businesses is that these businesses tend to look very different than their male counterparts. And so to overcome this, we randomize the gender on the applicant when they're being evaluated by the loan officers. That is, we had each business evaluated multiple times by different loan officers, sometimes as female-led and sometimes presented as male-led. What we found was that loan officers did not discriminate against businesses based on the owner's gender. It didn't affect how they made capital decisions in the competition itself, and it didn't affect how they decided, whether they decided to consider that business for a loan at their own institution. And what we found was that the loan officers didn't believe that the business owner's gender would predict that future business performance. And so in accordance with those beliefs, they didn't discriminate against gender when they were making their capital decisions. Now, our results suggested that gender discrimination was an unlikely contributor to that financial access gap, and so that we should be looking for other behaviors. And so one hypothesis was that women were less likely to seek capital for their business, raising the question of whether there are policies that could influence the demand for credit. There are several large programs in Ethiopia, such as the Women's Entrepreneurship Development Project, that specifically target and reserve products for women, including credit. And so we're now testing if such products that are exclusively reserved for women can be effective at closing the gender gap by increasing women's willingness to seek capital. In another strand of my research, we explore gender gaps in leadership. Globally, management and leadership positions are much more likely to be held by men. So using a traditional lab experiment, we recruited white-collar professionals in Ethiopia into a traditional lab setting, and we found that they were less likely to follow the same advice when it was provided by a woman than if an identical advice was provided by a man. However, if we presented those leaders as being highly trained and competent, then that discrimination actually reversed itself, and people were more likely to follow the advice by women. What this told us was that gender discrimination was a factor when we think about adherence to leadership, and credible signals of ability might help improve female leadership. Now, we were curious of whether these results would replicate in the United States, and so we took the experiment to a lab in the US. Now, in the US, we didn't find gender discrimination in the willingness to follow advice for men versus women, but we did find that people were more likely to follow advice when it was assertively stated, and that women were much more likely to shy away from that type of language. And so even in the absence of discrimination, because of that difference in choice of what language to use, we essentially generated a gender gap in leadership effectiveness. In some new work, we're moving away from that traditional lab to collaborate with firms on exploring how can we increase women's representation in management positions. Connecting both strands of my research, in that previous picture, we're working with the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia, which was in that skyline, on trying to understand how can we improve female representation in the financial sector as a whole. And some initial analysis from administrative data and survey employees suggests that women's trajectories tend to drop off at management levels, and one of the reasons might be that women are less likely to apply for internal promotions. I hope that you've enjoyed hearing about some of my research on gender gaps. It's an area that people don't always associate with economics, but is actually an incredibly active area of research in the field. It's an issue that I think goes beyond economics and even academics, in an area where I'd like to think research is helping to make a small dent in achieving gender equality.